G'day and welcome. Thanks for joining us. It was my real pleasure today to sit down with Councillor William Bourke. William's the founder of the Sustainable Australia Party. It was a really good chance for me to have a conversation with someone that really founded a micro party, figure out what they stand for, how they plan to navigate being one voice among many in Parliament. And I learned a lot about Sustainable Australia. I had kind of preconceptions about it without having looked too much into it. So it was a good chance for me to also get clarity on those sort of questions. If you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did, please do engage with the channel, leave a like, subscribe to the channel. It does incentivize me to keep doing this, and enjoy the video. Thanks. I didn't actually know this. Turns out you're a councillor.
I am a councillor at
Yeah.
North Sydney Council, former deputy mayor, and yeah, I was elected just my first term.
So again, thank you for taking the time because I can only imagine you've got a fair bit on your plate there. I guess I'll say first off, as much as this is an interview, it's not the 7:30 report. Feel free, go off on a tangent. Tell me something I didn't
All
ask.
good.
That's all part of it. If you get to the
Yeah.
end of the interview and you go, "Geez, I wish I didn't say that," just let me know. I'll cut that out at the end of the video.
No, there won't be any of that.
Sure, good. Well, thanks
No,
again.
no, we're a very straight down the line, open political party. There's no things that we think or say that we're not very happy and comfortable with.
And maybe that's a really good place to start. I was doing some research on you throughout the last couple of weeks. I was aware of the Sustainable Australia Party. I'd seen the logo maybe on the ballots, and I'm relatively well versed. I'd done a little bit of research. Going through your policies, I was pretty surprised at how reasonable they actually come across. I
Mm.
guess when we talk about minor parties, we're often expecting kind of more fringe opinions and beliefs, and these all
Yeah.
seem pretty reasonable. Do you want to maybe give us the kind of top policy positions that really sum up what a sustainable Australia is about?
Yeah, Jack, I guess our top line point that we make is that we're the only party that puts our environment first. Okay, so we put the environment at the center of our policy and decision making. I don't think any other party can say that. We are an independent community movement. We're not a left or right. We don't get into the progressive versus conservative either, which probably leaves us out of most political conversations. And so we sort of fall through the cracks there, so to speak. But yeah, and we take a science and evidence-based approach to policy. So yeah, I appreciate you actually taking the time to have a look at our policies. We are obviously concerned about our environment, our housing affordability, economic diversity, those sort of issues, and they're all interlinked. For example, the housing crisis in Australia, successive federal governments, Liberal, National, and Labor Greens, have encouraged hyper demand for housing, pushed up the price of housing massively over the last 20 years in particular. And that has had a devastating impact on our broader economy because it has sucked investment capital away from things like manufacturing and tech and all these really productive industries.
Mm.
And it has also caused a housing crisis that has created a country of haves and have-nots. So we would, tackle those sort of issues as a priority.
And on the subject of, I guess, the housing crisis, I guess that's the terminology we're all using for it now, which seems a
Yeah.
little. I don't remember it being like this maybe 5, 6 years ago, but here we find ourselves anyway. I was interested. I guess there's a dichotomy that's often drawn in the more general discourse between, I guess, the NIMBYs and the YIMBYs, right? The people that want
Yeah.
to build out, the people that want to build up, and I guess something that interests me about the Sustainable Australia Party is you said we don't want the sprawl and we don't want the high density housing. So that puts you guys in kind of a third position that I haven't come across before. How do you lower the price of housing, make sure that there's enough builds without creating that kind of sprawl or without going up?
Yeah, well, Jack, the media is not interested in this third way, but it is called SIMBY, Sustainability in My Backyard. And basically, what it says is in a place like North Sydney, where I'm a councillor, we've lost over 25% of our tree canopy in the last
Mm.
15 years alone. And that's because of private dwellings densifying. So knocking down houses and just building apartments wall to wall. So we're losing our tree canopy, our biodiversity in a time where Most people are concerned about climate change and the heat island effect. That's disastrous for our community and for our biodiversity and for our environment, for our quality of life, for our health. That's all disastrous. But the last thing we want to be doing, even worse, would be continuing to sprawl, over our farmland, and knocking over our bushlands and so forth that surround our major cities. I grew up on the urban fringe, actually, of Melbourne. Okay, so my backyard was bushland, and now it's just housing developments. So that to me is tragic, absolutely tragic. So how would I deal with this? SIMBY, sustainability in my backyard. These extreme positions of NIMBY and YIMBY should be discarded, and we should be talking about SIMBY. So that means what we have to do is put our environment first. We need to stop both forms of overdevelopment. And the way you do it is very, very simple. You address the root cause of the problem, which is government engineered hyper demand. Okay, we have had for 20 plus years government engineered hyper demand. So the specific policies, getting down to it, is to what we actually have to resolve is we have to get rid of tax concessions for property investors. We have to just phase them out. Capital gains tax concessions and negative gearing. That is government engineered demand for housing. We have to get rid of that. We have to also look at our lending practices through APRA. They've made some significant mistakes, removing lending floors on interest rates and the like over the last number of years. We need to not allow overseas buyers in our market. We have a housing crisis. I don't own a home. I'm an Australian citizen. I don't own a home. I've rented. And if it's good enough for me to rent, why isn't it good enough for a foreign student or a person sitting in the United States of America or New Zealand or Singapore? Why do they need to own a property here in Australia? They don't. Okay, so let's stop all overseas ownership of Australian housing. Simple as that. And of course, the population issue, Sustainable Australia Party is quite well known and quite well smeared by the so-called progressive left for calling for lower immigration. But the average annual permanent immigration program in Australia over the 20th century was 70,000 per year. 7 million migrants came to Australia in the 20th century, an extraordinarily successful program. We're simply saying, bring it back to normal, bring it back to that 70-odd thousand per year, no impact on refugees, no discrimination based on race, religion, etc., culture. Let's just bring it back to a number that's manageable and put our environment first, put our young people first to be able to afford a home, etc., etc. I mean, these things would be broadly agreed on by the Australian people, and this is why we have a housing crisis.
And it's interesting you brought up, I guess, you've called it a smear. I guess the perception that either the media or the public hold of the Sustainable Australia Party, because I went into your policies thinking, okay, well, there's probably some sort of discrimination thing here. There's probably, like, who's talking about lower immigration? You really are pretty much alone on that, aside from, again, those kind of fringe parties. And I'm looking into it, and kind of exactly as you've described, I checked your numbers. So you've said in your policies, I think it was between 14 and 20,000 refugees or asylum seekers. I looked at what we took in last year. I think it was about 17,000. So you're well within the range there. It's not as if you're advocating for more or less. It really comes down to, I guess, migrants, legal migration, lack of a better term. You'd be looking at roughly like a 30% of current levels. I think we took in around 200,000 last year, something like that. Again, COVID makes that a little weird. I guess as much as you're pointing out the problems that you're going to solve with that, lower house prices, lower demand for these sort of things, how do we address the sort of issues that we're going to be facing in the future? Declining population, declining birth rate, these sort of things. How does your party plan to address some of those issues?
Yeah, look, I think, Jack, again, it's really important to emphasize that population is just one of the levers that you pull. It's not the be all and end all. You don't have a stabilized population just for the sake of having a stabilized population. It's just one of the policies to provide housing affordability. one of the policies to help protect our environment, one of the policies to put some more upward pressure on wages, these sort of basic needs of people. It's just one of the policies that you tweak. What we're concerned about is that it's left out of every discussion. We're not saying it's everything. We're saying it affects everything. Okay, so there's a big difference there. So I guess to get back to your question, and you did say I could digress a little bit.
Yeah, please.
To get back to your question on population. So, there's this big aging scare out there, and it's a government engineered propaganda machine. They create a federal Department of Population, and they put out all of this nonsense. I'll give you an example. They say that we're going to have less people working to retire, to retired type ratio. They're doing this ridiculously outdated 15 to 64. If you're older than 64, if you're 65 and above, you will be a dependent. And if you're inside 15 to 64, you're working. That is absolute rubbish. But we've got record numbers of people 65 and above that are now working compared to even 5-10 years ago. We've got record participation in the workforce overall. So what you actually just need to do is, what is the percentage of people in the workforce? Not the percentage of people between 15, 64 or over 65. That's just a meaningless statistic. They're putting out this propaganda that says we're going to have more people 65 and above compared to working age. What they're not saying is we've actually aged 10 years on average since 1970, right? But we've actually got a higher workforce participation.
Yeah, interesting.
Like just think about that for a second. According to their statistics, we've got more people over 65 than we did in 1970 as a proportion of the population. So you'd think there'd be less people in the workforce, right? Wrong. We've actually got a much higher workforce participation at around 65, 66% today than we did back in 1970, even though we're on average 10 years older. So the point here is age does not determine workforce participation. Okay? Age does not. Economic opportunity determines workforce participation. Look at the increase in participation of women, for example, and older Australians who want to remain part-time or whatever. So the so-called aging crisis is a complete lie, right? And then secondly, I think that goes to the heart of your question, firstly. So we don't have a declining number of people in the workforce. And even if we did have a taper off, we'd only go back to what we were in the 60s and 70s, which was the golden era of, 50s, 60s, 70s, where we had, 50, 55% of people in the workforce. That was the golden era of Australia, 2% unemployment, etc. So there is no issue whatsoever with aging. In terms of skills, we have a great contribution from migrants. However, they also demand skills, okay? We're constantly told we need to bring in people to solve skill shortages. We've been told that for 20 plus years, and we've still got skill shortages. That's because, largely speaking, Australia's migration program is unskilled and semi-skilled. Of the 200-odd thousand, around about 120,000 is the skilled category, but they actually put the family of the skilled migrant in the skilled category. So only about half of the skilled category, 50, 60,000, is actually the primary skilled migrant. The rest of the children, the partner, etc. So there's a great net skills deficit in terms of needing doctors, nurses, trades people, etc. in the migration program. There's a far greater demand than there is supply. So it's a vicious circle. And the final point I'll make here, Jack, on this is it's morally bankrupt to be taking nurses and doctors from other countries. Morally bankrupt. A first world country like Australia stealing desperately needed doctors, nurses, engineers, and professionals, particularly from not so well off countries. So I'll leave you with that thought on that one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've never really heard it phrased in these sort of ways, and it is kind of making the cogs turn in my head a little bit. I guess my question that I would put to you is, again, as we've kind of both identified, you guys are really the only ones talking about this. What's the case in the against? If you can kind of steelman that, why should we, or why is the government pushing for so many migrants, so many people that are not necessarily coming in as skilled migrants on what they would have called the 457s back in the day, or so why are they just
Yeah.
bringing in this many people when it seems to cause so many issues?
Yeah, okay. Couple of things there. So even in the temporary migration program, which you're now talking about, I was talking about the permanent migration
Right,
program. There's a
interesting. Okay.
temporary migration program as well. Only about half the people in the temporary migration program are the primary skilled as well. So that
Mm,
one nets itself off. Half people are, half people aren't, but they all, every one of us demands skills. So that's the other thing. I'll talk about the negatives I'll talk about why they're doing it in a minute. But I'll just also talk about, you said we're the only one talking about this. Sadly, we're not the only one talking about this. We've got quite, I mean, other than fringe groups,
mm,
we've got a political party called One Nation, right, in the parliament. They're quite well known, and
mm,
they have been talking about immigration since Pauline Hanson hit the headlines in the 90s. And she poisoned this issue, absolutely poisoned it. And she made immigration about, ethnicity, culture,
mm.
race, blah, 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 religion, all those things. So it's made it incredibly difficult for someone like me and our party to come around and try and have a conversation about these things. And as things have gone along, they've picked up some of our talking points as well about infrastructure and the like.
Sure.
So it's really made it difficult for us to get any clean air. And the media and the government, which wants this very big population growth for reasons I'll talk about in a second, they want Pauline Hanson to be the person arguing against this because it positions them as sensible, right? It positions them in the moral high ground. They don't want people like me properly explaining the issues from a science, from an environmental point of view. They want, let's roll out Pauline Hanson again. What does she think about
Mm,
immigration? Oh, we got to stop the Muslims and blah blah blah. So in other words, it makes it a really difficult taboo subject for the whole society when Pauline Hanson's the face of this issue, which the media and the government love. She's what you'd call the useful idiot
sure.
in
Sure.
this sort of scenario. But why does the government want this? Well, there's several reasons. Obviously, it makes your GDP look bigger, right? Does my GDP look big in this? Yes, it does. But per capita, there's no evidence
Mm,
that population growth increases GDP. Indeed, the largest GDP per capita countries in the world have small to medium populations. So they can avoid a recession, even though we've had several per capita recessions, which means a reduction in our average living standards. GDP went up, and that's all that matters to the treasurer and the PM. We don't want a recession, so that it's kind of insurance against a recession. What economists regard as a recession, which I don't, and so effectively the Howard government did this, the Gillard government did this, the Rudd government did this, the Abbott government did this, the Turnbull, and to this day they're all doing it just to pump up, juice GDP,
mm,
right? That's one thing. The next thing is obviously to feed the property industry and keep house prices up, because there's a lot of voters out there who want their house price to continue to go up in this country of haves and have-nots. And I guess the other factor, Jack, is kind of that, again, the so-called progressive left that thinks it's morally right to have a large immigration intake and give more and more people a higher standard of living and better quality of life and blah, blah, blah. The 8 billion people of the world, we need to take more people in and give them a better quality of life. There's a moral aspect to
mm.
that they think that's the right thing to do. So I think that kind of covers that's what comes to mind at the moment as to why governments and the media, for example, a lot of the media is funded by property advertising, for example. some of the media would go out of business. Most of the commercial print media would go out of business tomorrow if they didn't have property advertising. So there's a very much a vested interest in the media around that as well.
And to take it to a much smaller policy proposal that you guys have, it's one that's kind of a pet issue of mine. I saw that you have a policy where you would make superannuation, I guess, voluntary. Could you talk a little more to that? Why is that a good idea? What are you trying to achieve with that policy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's to me it seems absolutely ridiculous that we don't have a guaranteed aged pension. Okay. In New Zealand, they have a universal age pension. So every person 65 and above gets the pension, everyone, but you're taxed. All right. You're taxed at your marginal rate. So you get the pension at 65, it might be 25 grand a year. And yeah, if you earn another $25,000, that's fine. You just get charged, you just get taxed at the marginal rate. So it's simple and fair. The superannuation industry is an enormously complex scenario. It's just creating. Have you ever heard the term bullshit jobs?
Uh, Having worked a few myself,
Google
yeah.
it. Google it. It's just people clipping your ticket, creating a massive industry for no particular benefit whatsoever. Now I'm being a bit harsh on the super industry here. I accept that, but you know they're saying they're investing in this and they're doing that and whatever. But you know, really, if we want to, if we want our money, we should get our money. If we don't, you can put it in super. But every Australian should have a universal age pension. We need a simpler and fairer tax system. We need a simpler and fairer super system. You know, we're spending an enormous amount of money setting up all this ridiculous labyrinth of superannuation accounts and self-managed funds and, you know, tax deductions. And there's 40 odd billion off the top of my head of tax concessions in super. You could cover the universal age pension gap with that. And yeah, I just think it's a ridiculously complex system and totally unnecessary.
And I think this speaks to something that I spoke about earlier, which I was kind of looking for like fringe ideas on the Sustainable Australia Party. And I get to, you know, superannuation voluntary. It's not that that's a fringe idea, but then you pair that with, yeah, if there's a universal, you know, pension for everyone over the age of 65. So I'm not getting the sense that you guys are out here, you know, cutting regulation, get rid of the red tape just for the sake of getting rid of the red tape. It seems to be geared towards an actual purpose. It seems to be geared towards trying to actually achieve some outcomes. I wonder when you were coming up with this, or what attracted you to this sort of line of thinking? Why did you go down the route of, you know, let's build rather than let's cut, or let's, you know, actually move forward? Because it's very easy to get sucked into, you know, today we would call it culture war stuff, but maybe 10 years ago it was something else. Why are you actually trying to do something, you know, practical rather than getting sucked into debate about trans people or something?
Yeah, good question. Because I think that's well covered by others. I respect everybody. We respect everybody. We don't get our members coming to us and, you know, talking about those things. People are worried about the environment. We're above average education and environmentally aware, sort of a base of people, a movement of people, and we really worry about the environment. And you know, we're educated on these issues. We're educated on the deindustrialization of our economy, which we think is madness. We understand that we've got what we call a property Ponzi economy, houses and holes. You know, mining. We're exporting non-renewable resources and barely taxing them. And you know, our high grade iron ore runs out in this century. So this is just a flicker of a moment in human history, and we're being really greed driven. So I don't know. We just think about things, I guess. And culture wars are something that is just yeah, it gets a lot of media and so forth, but they're well covered by the so-called conservative right and the so-called progressive left, and they can have those issues. You know, we just want to kind of provide some solutions. And yeah, we're probably not a sexy party. We're probably not, you know, something that the media can do clickbait on, other than saying, oh yeah, they're anti-migration or something. You know, we had a newspaper up in New South Wales called the Echo, up in the Byron Northern Rivers area. It's quite a widely, publicised, distributed newspaper, and they did a short summary of all the parties, and they said, "Oh yeah, really good policies, except anti-migration." And it's just like a repellent to voters, and it's a lie. It's a lie. We're pro-migration, but yeah, we get that all the time. We get, "Oh, they've got some good stuff, but I'm really worried about them being anti-migration." And again, which we're not. We're pro-migration, and so it's frustrating because people are getting the wrong idea. But yeah, we have these policies for a really good reason, not just for the sake of it. So we've got a good bunch of people, and we like looking at what other countries are doing, or what some experts are saying that are not associated with a big bank or a big. Most of the economists you hear in the media are the ComSec chief economist, or they've got a vested interest. So
Sure.
yeah, we're open, we're listening, and we're happy to learn and change our policies if the evidence sort of suggests.
And on to, I guess, that question, how do we actually get things done? So Sustainable Australia is obviously a micro party. You've had some success, obviously, at the council level. I guess once Sustainable Australia, assuming Sustainable Australia kind of catches on a bit, what's the plan to, I guess, get your agenda done in Parliament while also being considerate of the fact that you're one voice among many? How do you actually progress these sort of things in a way that gets done the change you want, while recognizing that you're going to have to compromise on some of these values to make it happen?
Yeah, I think compromise, not letting your perfect be the enemy of the good is a value, or a something that I believe in. For example, if someone said to me negative gearing, we could just have it at one property, right? I'd say, okay, that's a good improvement, that's a good outcome. If that's all we can get, I'll go for it, type thing.
Sure.
So I think there's a real compromise required in politics, but also I really think that what Sustainable Australia Party probably hasn't done well is, because of lack of resources, is put out good content, put out good videos, put out good social media. We're trying to improve and evolve every day. So yeah, I really think that social media is very powerful. We're pretty much blacklisted by the mainstream media for some of the reasons we've talked about, but and some of the perceptions that you might have had, or what have you. But yeah, they don't want these uncomfortable truths and ideas out there in the mainstream media as a general rule. But we can do a lot through social media and good content, and that's where we've got to lift our game.
And if I can take you to, I guess, some national issues that are prominent at the moment, does the Sustainable Australia Party have a position on the Indigenous voice to Parliament?
We don't have a set position. We're a party that kind of offers a lot of our. If we've had an elected MP in Victoria, and he had a conscience vote on a whole lot of issues. I think on the old scale, you'd call us a centre-left type of party. Not that we use that language, but it would be, you'd probably say that if you looked at our policies, against privatisation, and we believe strongly in social justice. We just have a different version of what that means to some. Environment, workers' rights, those sort of things we believe in. But no, the short answer is we don't have a set position. Personally, I'd like to see an Aboriginal voice to Parliament. Whether that's in the Constitution or not, I don't think is the big issue. I'd like to see Aboriginal recognition in the Constitution. With the voice, yeah, to be honest, I haven't spent a lot of time looking at it, but I don't know whether there's an opportunity to put it in place through Parliament, which I think Albanese was talking about at one stage, and refine it over 5 years, and then once we kind of get the balance right and are comfortable with it, because I'm worried that it won't go through, and then that's not a good look, because I think there's enormous goodwill for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, and so a no vote's going to kind of hurt reconciliation.
Certainly, yeah. It is a rough one. We can look at the Republic vote, for example, 30 years later, or I guess 20 odd years later, and
Yeah,
still kind of dead in the water there. So no,
it
I
is.
understand what you're talking about there. Yeah, it does ring true. And I guess another one again to my own personal pet issues. This one's less relevant now, but there was some talk about um, allowing first home buyers to dip into their superannuation in order to purchase a property. I get a sense of where you're going to go with this, but do you mind? Have
Yeah,
you thought about that at all? What do you conceive of that idea?
yeah. The short answer there is under current sort of policies, I'd be a yes. You know, that should be something that people can do. I think owning a home is more important than having super at the end, because if you haven't got a home and you're on the pension, you're absolutely stuffed,
Hmm.
right? Um, so yes, under certain conditions, but if we had, the broader, addressing the root causes of the housing crisis, we wouldn't need to be giving out first home buyer grants. We wouldn't need to be people dipping into their super. But yeah, our policies sort of talk about you can phase out super as well. And if that was phased out, you could do a drawdown on your super as it was phased out to back to what it should be, a universal age pension and an optional super. You should be able to, if you've got a couple of $100,000 in your super. We don't want everyone taking it out all at once, because
Sure.
for things like inflation and other issues, um, and giving that industry time to adjust. But yeah, the long story is I don't support that as the way it should be. But given where we are, yes, I think you should be able to draw down your super
And
for a
I guess
home purchase.
the next thing I would love to hear a little more about is the prospects for sustainable Australia. So, what's the next kind of few years look like for you guys? Are there any election seats you're targeting? What's sustainable Australia doing over the next few years?
Yeah, well, I told you at the start we're a pretty open and transparent lot here, and we don't really have secrets. So we're pretty disappointed at the New South Wales Upper House election not winning a seat there. That was a pretty important situation for us, but we didn't have the resources to really compete in the way we hoped. So that has placed a bit of a question mark on what's next. We're doing some high level strategic thinking at the moment. We are considering running in the Fadden by-election in the Gold Coast. So that's kind of where things are at. Just we're being a bit introspective at the moment. We're taking
Mm-hmm.
the opportunity to think about how we present ourselves. How can we challenge these uh, smears? How can we get the truth out there? How can we build our resources and get on top of the compliance and administrative workload that the electoral commissions and uh, fundamentally the major parties through legislation put on you? Yeah, the lack of funding and the fact that they fully fund themselves. It's kind of like the person earning 50 grand a year pays the top rate of tax, and the millionaires pay nothing. Is the electoral system we work in, because they get all their spend back because they get 4% or more of the vote. So in a fair system, all parties would get electoral funding regardless of their vote.
Mm.
But that's again off on a bit of a tangent. So yeah, we're just working through all that at the moment, Jack, and thinking about how we present ourselves. But yeah, we're looking at the Fadden by-election as potentially an opportunity to get out there and see how that goes.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to have this discussion with me, William. I'm just conscious that the Zoom meeting's going to run out in a minute. Is there anything you wanted to end on here? Any final thoughts you have, or something you wanted to wrap up with?
Look, I guess I'll just repeat the fact that, Jack, we are the only party that will put our environment first. And if you look at the housing crisis, the plan of the Greens, for example, to build 1 million new houses, incredibly environmentally destructive,
Mm.
as stated in the State of the Environment report. Urban development, incredibly environmentally destructive. So instead of addressing things with hypersupply, environmentally destructive hypersupply, let's address the root cause, hyperdemand. But yeah, people can check us out, sustainableaustralia.org.au, sign up to our newsletter, find out a bit more. And yeah, we welcome, genuine inquiries.
William, thank you very much again for the time. Make sure, audience, you go check out this website. Like I said at the start, I was really looking for this weird racism, discrimination sort of stuff. I didn't find it in there. Maybe it's there. Maybe someone can dig in and find it, but it wasn't there for me to find. So, William, thank you again. And I look forward to seeing how this kind of party unfolds in future. Yeah, and I'd love to stay in contact, and I'll love to have this conversation with you again sometime.
Love to as well. Thanks, James.
All right. Thanks, mate. See ya.
Cheers.